What's up? Welcome to the video and Happy New Year. And what better way to start off the new year than to talk about one of the biggest phones out there right now. This is the iPhone 14 Pro, and we've had it since it basically came out. It's probably been like 2.5, 3 months now, I think. At least 2.5, 3 months. Apple introduced some interesting changes this year around with the 14 Pro that definitely adjusted the day-to-day usability aspects of some parts of this phone. And we really wanted to take our time with this review and make sure that as Apple released things like software updates, we wanted to assess and see how they would impact this phone in a good way or in a bad way. And I think we've got a lot of time under our belt now. We're really excited to talk about it. So let's get into it. Let's talk iPhone 14 Pro. And by the way, look at that purple color. That's nice. All right, let's do this. So if you were to just glance at the iPhone 14 Pro and tell me that it looks exactly the same as the 13 Pro, I would tell you that you are absolutely correct. This is now, what are we going on, 3 years of the Pro models looking essentially the same. Like when we had the iPhone 11 Pro, it had the rounded edges and things like that. And then once they jumped from 11 Pro to 12 was whenever we kind of saw the hardware change. And normally Apple has been about changing the look of the hardware every couple of years, but we've really had very similar looking Pro model iPhones from 12 to now 14. But even with that, even with it looking the same, the iPhone 14 Pro does come with some differences compared to last year's 13. We have some internal upgrades and some nice hardware features that are now built into the phone. We've got some interesting changes up front with the display, and of course we are looking at a new camera system on the back as well. So I think that's how we're going to break down the review. So let's go ahead and get started with internals. Let's talk about what I'm probably considering to be the least or the most underwhelming upgrade of the iPhone 14 Pro, and that's actually the A16 Bionic. So yeah, we did get a bump from A15 in last year's 13 Pro to A16 in this year's 14 Pro. But if you notice, whenever Apple typically drops their new phones and they talk about the new chip inside, they love to talk about the major leaps in performance from previous generation to next generation. And we didn't really see that with this year's A16. Now the A16 does perform better than the A15 in a whole bunch of statistical categories. And from a performance perspective, I had no problem with the A16. It handles everything you want to do on the iPhone just fine, and I never saw any drops in frame rates for the higher refresh rate screen, the ProMotion display on the 14 Pro. But there's a really interesting story that we found on Engadget, and I'll leave the link to the story in the description down below if you wanted to take a look at the full article. But from what the article outlines, there have been some pretty accurate reports that have come out that have basically said that Apple actually had some very, very ambitious plans for the A16, and they ended up bumping into some issues with it as it started getting much closer to the unveiling of the actual iPhone 14 Pro. So what ended up happening was the A16 that we have in this particular model was actually more of a fallback plan for Apple, and I think that's really why we didn't see them boast about these major improvements to their processing power or all the cool new features that they brought to this year's A16. I'm hoping whatever ambitious plans they had, we'll see on, I was going to say next year, but we're already here in next year. So this year's iPhone 15 Pro, from what the report outlined, it was supposed to be a way to introduce ray tracing into the processing power, which I guess would be really interesting to see. So only time will tell on that, but at the end of the day, the A16 Bionic, it still performs really well. I just thought that was a interesting tidbit of information. If you want to check out more, like I said, it'll be in the description. But with all that being said, there are still some cool hardware features that are built into that end up becoming safety features that hopefully you won't ever have to actually use or test out at the end of the day. One being emergency SOS texting via satellite, and another one being crash detection. So let's start with crash detection. The iPhone is able to use some clever bits of hardware internally. We won't get into all the details, but essentially the phone can now detect whenever you've been in a car crash, and if you actually have and you don't respond whenever the prompt comes up on your phone, the iPhone will automatically contact emergency services for you, and it'll also contact your emergency contacts and let them know that you've been in an accident as well, that's just fantastic. Now obviously that's not something that we were able to test here in the studio. We don't want to test it. I hope you never have to try it either if you have this phone, but it's cool that that's there. And should you find yourself in a remote area where cell service doesn't work, you can actually send an emergency text message to local authorities through a system that Apple essentially has set up using satellites in space. Now, the way Apple shows it, you kind of have to be in a slightly clear area. You have to be able to position your phone to align with a satellite in their system. But should you need to use something like that, I think that is an incredibly powerful safety tool. And, my hat's off to Apple for incorporating those types of features in the iPhone 14 Pro. And another hardware feature, I don't really know if you can call it like a hardware feature, but it definitely impacted a hardware aspect of the phone, is that the entire iPhone 14 lineup, at least here in the United States, is now exclusively eSIM, which is, I think, an interesting move on Apple's part. I didn't think from an eSIM perspective, the technology is advanced and seamless enough to just decide from 13 to 14, like, boom, we're just going to go strictly eSIM, to the point where it's going to be really easy for everyone to switch from a phone that now has a physical SIM card to a phone that doesn't even have a SIM tray to pop out anymore. My activation process with eSIM was relatively smooth, but I don't think that would necessarily be the case for a lot of other people out there. I don't know. I'm hoping that Apple has really thought this out. It seems like it's one of those moves that we've seen Apple make in the past, where they're really trying to get ahead of the curve technologically and just hope that everyone else kind of catches up with them. And in some cases, I think it's worked, like when they removed the headphone jack, but we've also seen Apple try it in other cases and it hasn't necessarily worked, like when they shifted the MacBook Pros from having all of the usable ports to just Thunderbolt ports. And we now see that on the next gen MacBook Pros, Apple kind of reverted back to that and went back to some of the things that people were used to. So I'm really curious to see how eSIM is going to evolve on the iPhones later on down the line. But for now, with this generation, it's strictly eSIM. And if you upgrade from a phone that has a physical SIM to one that has an electronic SIM, I really hope your process is smooth. Now, with Apple transitioning from A15, which was a 5 nanometer processor, to A16, which is a 4 nanometer processor, I was hoping that that would mean even better battery life, because my battery life on the 13 Pro Max was fantastic. And unfortunately, even with giving Apple time to release multiple updates for iOS 16, my battery life on my iPhone 14 Pro Max, mind you, so it's the largest battery size they have, is not that great. So on the 13 Pro, I was able to charge that phone maybe like once every day and a half. In some cases, if I really wasn't using the phone too much, it was actually every 2 days that I was charging it. But with the 14 Pro Max, and mind you, my usability hasn't really changed. Like, my usability on the iPhones has been the same for like the past 3 years now, I would say. But with the 14 Pro Max, I am charging this phone every single day. Like, whether or not it's to a point where my battery is dead more towards the evening and I'm topping it up overnight, or maybe I'm able to get through the night, but then middle of the afternoon the next day, my battery is at 25% and I have to top it off. At that point in time, there's typically always 24 hours maximum between whenever I'm charging the phone. And again, we tried to give some time for more versions of iOS 16 to come out to see if maybe it was a software thing, but I'm more so leaning towards it being a hardware related thing. And it's actually one of the new features that's exclusive to the 14 Pro, and that's the always on display. So yes, always on display has finally, if I could literally display the speech in front of you, it'd be all caps, finally, exclamation point, has made its way to the iPhone 14 Pro. And you know how Apple is. Apple has never really been the type of company, at least in some ways, where they try to introduce something new to their phones first. Always on display has been around on especially Android devices for, I don't even know how many years now. I think you would need more than 2 hands to count how many years Android phones have had always on display, but it's here, and in typical Apple fashion, they've done it in their own typical Apple way. And I'm glad we waited for Apple to drop some software updates, because now the always on display gives you some more options than it first did whenever the 14 Pros launched. So let's talk about both. When the 14 Pros first launched, always on display was essentially just a super dim version of your lock screen. Like the always on display, typical to what I'm accustomed to because I do have a lot of Android phones, the always on display actually displayed like the colors of your wallpaper. Just think about looking at your phone. You know that brief period where like your phone's display is about to time out and the display gets really, really dim and you know the screen's about to turn off? Well, like the always on display, it just basically like it never actually turns off, but it just gets super dim like that. So you can still see the colors of your wallpaper. The variable refresh rate drops down to 1 hertz, which allows certain bits of information like live widgets to still kind of update, but just, you know, in much slower intervals. And you can even see things like if you're listening to music, you can see what kind of music you're listening to. Whenever the tracks change, you'll see the track change on the always on display. If you get a notification, you'll see it pop up on the bottom of your screen. You can see who it's from, what application it's about, all sorts of interesting things. Now, I do believe because of how Apple set it up initially, or at least this is what I thought. I thought because Apple had the colors still displaying but really dim, a lot of different, you can still see animations and stuff like that. You can still see notifications come in. I thought that was the reason why my battery life wasn't super great on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. But then recently, Apple dropped iOS 16.2, and that included an option to not show the wallpaper. So it was somewhat reminiscent of what I would see on Android phones, where instead of displaying color, it was just straight up black. It would show your clock, it would show notifications and stuff like that, but it would exclude the colors and design of your wallpaper. Much more basic looking. I thought that was gonna kind of save my battery life, but even with that feature turned on, it didn't improve the battery life on my iPhone 14 Pro Max whatsoever. So I think it's just related to the always on display. I don't think it has anything to do with whether or not you show the colors of the wallpaper or you don't. But even with that, I'm not going to turn that feature off. I am going to keep it on because it is something that's exclusive to the 14 Pro and it's finally here. I think I'm just going to deal with the mediocre battery life that it brings. But if you own a 14 Pro, let me know in the comment section if you've turned off always on display and if that's actually helped your battery life experience in your opinion. I'd really be curious to know. Now, of course, we have to spend some time talking about what is easily the most talked about feature of the iPhone 14 Pro, and it also has to be the most ridiculously named feature that Apple has ever released. If there's anything more ridiculous that Apple has dropped, let me know. But it is, of course, the dynamic island. Now, if you are really into Apple products to the point where like you're keeping up to date with leaks and rumors of what the next model is going to look like, then you'll know like 6 to 8 months prior to this phone even dropping, there were screenshots and leaks all over the place of what Apple is going to do with the design of the iPhone 14 Pro. And what we saw was a pill-shaped cutout for the Face ID components, which Apple has shrunk down quite a bit now, and then a separate circular cutout for the selfie camera, which is what we got on this year's 14 Pro. If you hold up the 14 Pro under light at the right angle, you can see that there are 2 physical separate cutouts for the hardware. But what Apple decided to do was fill in the gap between the 2 using software and essentially create what was supposed to just be a static hardware experience. They flipped it and turned it into a dynamic and interactive software experience. So the dynamic island can essentially take certain aspects of the phone, like if you're running applications and those applications have background processes, they can actually interact with the dynamic island to give you some cool usability features. So to give you an example, if you are listening to music and you swipe up to go to the home screen, there'll be a really cool animation where like the music app will float up into the dynamic island, it'll expand and it'll show you these cool like animations, like it might show a really small graphic of the album art that you're listening to, or maybe it'll show like some moving sound waves for the music that you're listening to. My favorite feature for the dynamic island is when you're on a phone call, let's say, and you put it on speaker and you swipe up to go to the home screen, some elements of the phone call jump up into the dynamic island and you can see these cool like sound bars that dynamically move up and down as the person is talking to you. and as you're talking to them. And they even have like different colors and stuff like that based on, I think, the volume of the phone call conversation that you're having. So the louder you talk, I think the more colorful the sound bars get. It's just really cool. And they've definitely thought about it quite a bit, because it'll even change how it looks if you do like two applications that have background tasks at the same time. So let's say you're listening to music and, I don't know, you're navigating on GPS at the same time. You'll see dynamic island animations for both the music you're listening to and then maybe a separate pop-up for your GPS navigations. And it's really cool. You can touch it to like return to the application, or you can push and hold to like open up a small widget so you can see what you're actually interacting with as well. My thoughts on the actual dynamic island are, is it something that is actually going to sell the iPhone 14 Pro? Like, are you going to look at it and think to yourself, oh, I need the iPhone 14 Pro for the dynamic island? Absolutely not. But I do tip my hat off to Apple in essentially taking what was supposed to be a static bit of hardware and just display design and flipping that narrative and turning it into an actual software experience that, while the features are not like groundbreaking or so exciting to the point where you want to go get it, it's at least a lot more usable than it was going to be. So Dynamic Island is here. The name is ridiculous, but the features are kind of cool. Now, turning the phone over is where we're going to see our last major change for the 14 Pro, and that is some, bumps in the camera department, which was really interesting to see because Apple has stuck to the same 12 megapixel main sensor for several years now. So it was really cool to see that Apple at least bumped up the main sensor on the 14 Pro to 48 megapixels. Now, I want to spend some time talking about photo quality, which is the same standard iPhone photo quality. Photos look great. They're full of detail. On the 14 Pro specifically, I found that things like skin tone color and reproduction were really, really true and accurate. So that was great to see. And I mean, it's a flagship iPhone camera experience, so it's probably going to be exactly what you come to expect. Now, a couple of things here. So main camera is 48 megapixels. We have a 12 megapixel ultra wide and we have a 12 megapixel telephoto. Now, the key thing to remember with the 48 megapixel wide angle is that by default, there'll be pixel binning going on. So even whenever you are just pointing and shooting, the photos will be saved at a 12 megapixel size. Now, if you want to actually shoot in the full 48 megapixel size, you're going to have to make sure that you're shooting in ProRAW mode before you take the photo. But just mind you that file sizes in ProRAW are going to be massive. So like what I was finding was an average 12 megapixel shot was like 5 megabytes maybe. And then I'm taking a 48 megapixel shot, just quick point and shoot, and that file size was like 48 to like sometimes above 50 megabytes. So it is very, very significant in terms of like the difference of file size. So just keep that in mind if you go for one of the smaller storage options. And as far as a new video feature, there is a new one called Action Mode, which is supposed to help with essentially stabilizing the video footage if you're doing something like, I don't know, holding the iPhone and like running and you're trying to capture an action scene. I'm not like a director of any kind. I'm not capturing a lot of action-packed events in the day or anything like that. But when we did test it, we found the feature to be pretty useful. It almost kind of gives off this vibe like you have, like you're using the iPhone with a gimbal almost to an extent. So if you're someone that likes to run around with your phone and capture video throughout the day, you'll probably find that feature useful as well. So as far as the camera upgrades go, really interesting to see. And the camera bump, by the way, is absolutely massive, especially if you have the regular 14 Pro. I mean, that module on the back is taking up a lot of space on the back of that phone. So good to see them. Quality is still there, and we're still getting some new features. But that is essentially it. That is the iPhone 14 Pro and the iPhone 14 Pro Max. As far as the differences between Pro and Pro Max, it's really just display size and battery, which is why we kind of lumped them into one for this review. Let's talk pricing, colors, and ultimately if it's going to be worth it for you to consider to buy based on like what iPhone you might currently have. So I'm happy to say that Apple kept the prices the same compared to last year's 13 Pro. So if you want to get a 14 Pro, it's $999 for 128 gigs of storage. If you want to bump up to the 14 Pro Max, it is $1099 for 128 gigs of storage, and then obviously pricing goes up as you increase storage. There are two new colors this year around, deep purple and space black. Both of them look sick. They're, you know, they're neutral-ish. Like, even the deep purple, it has to hit the light the right way for you to actually see that it's purple. A lot of times it just looks like a dark black or maybe like a dark blue color, but still looks really cool. I love the purple color, but it's tough for me to sit here and just like very easily recommend the 14 Pro or even the 14 Pro Max, especially if you have something like a 12 Pro or a 13 Pro. There are obviously nice changes and there are a lot of cool features like always on display and dynamic island that you might find will make the upgrade worthwhile. If you're like me and you have absolutely zero self-control and you see purple dynamic island always on, you'll just jump and do it anyways. But I think if you are willing to wait to see what the iPhone 15 Pro is going to bring to the table, I feel like that is going to be the iPhone that might bring some much more major changes to the table, and it might be worth upgrading if you already have a great device like a 12 Pro or a 13 Pro. If you're dealing with some older iPhones like 11s, 10s, 10s and stuff like that, I think this is going to be a great bump for you. But if you have something slightly newer, if you really care to maximize your money, I think it might be worth the wait just to kind of see what Apple will drop later on in the fall of this year. But either way, I hope you enjoyed the review. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. If you're new, hit the subscribe button. If you're already subscribed, you were amazing. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys had a happy and safe New Year again. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace. Keep up with like leaks and rumors of what to expect for the next model. You'll know that like 6 months in advance, prior to the 14 even dropping, there were already like leaks and screenshots of line. Did you hear me say that?